Welcome to the Tradie Wife Life podcast, brought to you by Tradies in Business, where we talk to tradie wives about their goals, their challenges, their hopes and dreams, and how their trade business can help with that. Hello, listeners, and welcome back to Tradie Wife Life. I have a fantastic guest. This one is this could be very interesting for both our male and female listeners, but I have asked our guest here today specifically for our female listeners because we have a fair bit in common, us tradie wives, and that is negotiating some very challenging conversations. And I have an expert in negotiating challenging conversations with us today, Nicole Davidson. Thank you so much for being here.
It is always a pleasure, Nic.
Nicole, you and I have spoken quite a few times. We've done a couple of podcasts over on the Tradies in Business podcast. You have worked with our client base several times now, joined us at conference last year. We had a lot of fun at conference.
Indeed.
And so I know a lot about you, and chances are some of our listeners will also know a lot about you, but there are some listeners here that do not know who Nicole is and where you've come from. And I'm going to try and not make this confusing today. So I'll talk about myself in the third person. Nicole, tell us who you are. How did you come to be talking to me today?
Fantastic. So, Nic. Nicole Davidson, I run a business that's called Nicole Davidson Negotiation. I have to say, when I named the business, I wanted to keep it simple. So it's who I am. It's what I do. So I have been a specialist in helping people with negotiations for about 11 years now. And what I do is I help in a couple of ways. One is that I teach people and I give them the skills that they need ahead of time so that they can go into negotiations and challenging conversations with a lot more confidence and a lot more strategy so that they're in the best place possible from the start of that process. I also work with people when perhaps they're in the middle of a conversation or a negotiation where things are getting a bit difficult and they need a bit of a helping hand in that real-time process. And that's where I've got my negotiation GP service, which is an online help desk, if you like, for negotiations. And then finally, I work as a mediator where I come in as an independent third party to assist people who are in conflict. And I really try and help each of them understand what's going on at a sort of broader level than they may have thought about it, and then help them come up with some creative options to actually get an outcome that works for both sides.
I've sat through quite a few mediations. That sounds terrible. Trust me, they weren't all for me. They've been for some other people as well, and a few for myself. I make no bones about the fact that I'm a divorced woman, and so I had to negotiate with my children's father around our care arrangements and our financial arrangements and what that would look like. And I actually really enjoyed the process because if I call myself out, maybe he'll listen to this one day and feel very chuffed about himself. But at the time, I probably didn't take a lot of his perspective into consideration because I was wounded and it was very much about me. And then on a work sense, I've had negotiations with clients where things have gone awry at times. And again, I think it can take a lot of the emotion out of the room when you have a third party there that is trained in negotiation to help you understand, okay, I really didn't think about the client's point of view, or perhaps they didn't really think about my point of view and how it's impacted each of us. So I think that it's one of those services or one of those times where many of us would approach with trepidation and fear. And yet actually it's really empowering and a great opportunity for you to move through a process instead of being as stuck as you are. I wonder from your point of view, I like if I wasn't doing what I do, I think I'd love to do what you do. I can imagine you have some great stories, and I don't want you to go into those today, and I'm sure you wouldn't because you're far too professional for that. And there must be some patterns that you see that you could make us aware of that perhaps we fall into as humans trying to communicate together that are our default. Like you'd almost see walls go up at times, I can imagine. And I wonder if there's some of those that we could uncover today that we could start to be more mindful of when we are communicating together.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the interesting thing that you said there before, Nic, was, how going through the mediation process, you realised you weren't really taking into account the ex-partner's perspective as much. And that's one of the biggest things that comes across when we get into this is, we see the world from our own perspective and our own lens. And it's actually really difficult sometimes to see the other perspective. And even if you can, I think one of the challenges is that we often think that we have to change the other person's perspective. Even if we can get in there and understand where they're coming from, we feel like we've got to show them that their perspective is wrong and ours is right. And what you get into is then this sort of adversarial battle where it's, one of us is going to be right, one of us is going to be wrong. And that drives ego on both sides, because who likes to be wrong? And so you get into this really difficult process. And so when I work with people, it's all about going, you need to understand the other person's perspective. You need to understand what's driving their thinking and why they believe the outcome that they want is right. You don't necessarily need to change that if you can come up with something that sort of allows you to keep your perspective and them to keep theirs, and you both can compromise a little bit, but ultimately you don't want to just compromise. You actually want to understand those perspectives and actually find some extra value that you can put into those solutions, rather than just that sort of 50-50 split the difference. We'll both get half of what we want.
Absolutely. I think when we are looking at it from a possibility or a solution-based thinking, we can get to that ideal outcome for both parties rather than it being about compromise. Compromise, I don't think, is necessarily a good thing. Yes, we do always have to give a little bit, both of us, to get to a solution. Yeah. But if we make it about the solution, it stops being quite so personal. And I think that's a big key to what we're talking about here today. Most conversations are emotion-based. Even when we try not for them to be emotion-based, they become triggering. And suddenly we're having all of these feelings or bringing our own personal stories into those conversations. And the other party in the conversation has got no idea about what the trigger was or what the story is that you're telling yourself that becomes part of that a negotiation that you're having with someone. And therefore, we don't necessarily move to the space that we need to. So I think that, often having that third party in place is just that it's almost like a guiding light to help you find, first of all, we're more measured when we are inviting somebody else into the conversation. We're more likely to take a breath and stop and listen, because all we really want is to be heard, and the other person wants to be heard. And when we're forced to listen to a third party, it kind of, there's a shortcut there that happens so that everybody gets heard.
Well, and this is one of the interesting things, because coming back, we talked about one of the problems being people fail to think about the other person's perspective at all, or just go, I know what it is, and they're wrong. But this is the other problem, is even if the other person shares their perspective, the vast majority of people are actually not very good at listening. Yes. While we're listening, the message that's going through our head is, the minute we hear something we disagree with, the temptation is to start having a little dialogue inside, going all the reasons why what they just said was wrong, and what I'm going to say to counteract this, and how am I going to convince them to change it. Now, the problem with that, and any of the tradie wives who also are tradie mums will understand this, you cannot listen to two voices at once. No. So just as if I've got my two kids both yelling and screaming at me because they both want something at the same time, if I've got someone in a challenging conversation who's talking at me, but my internal voice is triggered and is having all these discussions about why are they wrong, how am I going to convince them to change, I'm actually not listening to the other person. And so being able to do this, it's really, really important to be able to slow down the whole process so that you can actually engage and listen. And the biggest tip I've got for listeners who want to be better at listening is, as you're going, you want to be paying attention, but then I want to ask a question based on, what did I just hear? I want to be curious. So if you can go into this with a real mindset of curiosity, okay, so you said that, you think it's not the right time to do this investment because cash flow's not strong enough. Tell me, what do you think cash flow needs to look like in order to be ready for this investment? If cash flow was stronger, what other things might be getting in the way of this for you? So I'm actually going to take what they've said, and I really want to dig down as much as I can to get to really, where are they coming from?
I think that we were all done a bit of a disservice when we were younger. My dad used to tell me all the time, curiosity killed the cat.
Yes, we did get told that.
Yes, I'd be in trouble all the time for being a nosy Parker, and I wasn't allowed to ask all of the questions. When I was just honestly being curious, it came off as that nosy, sticky beaky kind of concept. And in actual fact, I feel like it really dampened that curiosity spirit within me, and I've had to work very hard to bring it back, because working with clients the way I do, I need to be curious. But I reckon all of our listeners are very similar. We've had that curiosity dampened through life. It can be a hard skill to turn back on. Is there a way, a shortcut to turning it back on? Or are there specific questions that can help us then mindfully turn that curiosity back on when we're in a situation where we need more information?
Um, oh, I don't know that there's any really easy shortcuts to it. I think the first thing we need to be conscious of is just being aware of what's going on. And, even, and the thing is too, if we've been having difficult conversations, and we all have difficult conversations from time to time, and even when you become aware and you start going, oh, I want to do this better, you will have conversations. And I still have conversations. I mean, I've been allegedly an expert in this stuff for nearly 12 years, but there are still times where I come out of it and I go, why did I say that? Why did I do that? But it's that taking the time afterwards to reflect and go, what could I have said differently, or what could I have asked, that is the best way to kind of improve those skills, because it's the reflective piece that is where the learning comes from. Now, one of the things that I would say is, what you want to be doing is becoming aware in a conversation of where am I speaking and when am I questioning? And, particularly one of the things that we have a tendency to do is if we're not sure about something, if we're buying ourselves time to think, we often will just start talking about something, and we'll probably not be as coherent as we could be, because at the same time we're speaking, we're trying to think and process stuff as well. So I always say, when you get a response that you don't like or something and you need that time, it's just find another question to ask. And questions are great because, particularly if it's a question, actually the question that you ask might not be as relevant as it could be, but that's where you've got time to go, I'm actually not going to listen as much to that answer because I'm going to do my thinking here.
Yes.
Or even better is actually to be really transparent and actually say, look, you've just given me some information that I didn't know before. I hadn't really thought about that perspective. Can I have a few minutes to think about it before I, decide what does that mean for where I want to come? And, that ability to slow things down and not feel rushed, which once again, it's really difficult in our busy lives. You're at home, you've got, hubby's probably been out at work, you've been, doing your stuff as well. You've had to look after the kids in the evening. You've probably got half an hour to catch up, which you don't really want to be talking about work anyway, but when else are you going to do it? So you want it to happen quickly, but if you rush these things, that's where conflict can grow at a faster rate.
It's very true. I was taught a technique when I was learning how to interview people for positions. So I worked for a big pharmacy firm and did a lot of the interviewing for the entire firm, including people, I'd have to, my role traditionally in pharmacy, the pharmacist is at the top of the tree, and yet we sat in a different position. So I got to interview lots of pharmacists. And so I had to do a fair bit of training to be able to carry the authority into those conversations, given in a typical role, I wouldn't have been seen to have that authority to have that conversation. Yep. And so one of the techniques I was taught, and I now teach all of our clients, is the power of the pause. I think it goes back to exactly what you're talking about here. It's actually a little bit of manipulation using it within an interview, but it's going to help you flesh out a bunch of information. Yeah. I don't necessarily advocate for this one to be used with your partner. I don't know that it always works. And sometimes if the pause is a reflective pause, so you can have a moment to catch up to where the conversation's gone, that's not a bad thing. In this case, using the pause in an interview allows your interviewee to fill the space, because we get uncomfortable with space. We become so trained and conditioned to lots of noise and thinking fast and filling the space that's available. We tend to say the stuff we haven't already pre-thought about.
Yeah.
That's where you get a far better indication of the character of the person that you're currently interviewing. So I just wanted to throw that in there.
No, and definitely silence and that pause is a really good technique in any negotiation. And I think that the skilled user of the pause knows when it becomes just that little bit awkward where they are going to feel pressure to say something to actually now it's becoming really desperately uncomfortable. And it's being able to sort of just observe what's going on. I use those pauses all the time, whether it's, with my husband, I will use it. He'll say something and I'll just be like, and I'll just wait. He knows what I'm doing now because he's heard me often enough that he knows exactly what it is. But that's okay. I'm fine with that. He knows I'm leaving him space to say more.
Yeah.
But the other thing is, whenever I'm running training courses or even in mediations, I will allow a really good time and it's not just this idea that we might be, manipulating them, as I think was the word that you used, but it's actually, we need to understand that there are different types of people in the world. And if you've got someone who is more on the introvert spectrum than the extrovert spectrum, they actually need that pause to stop and reflect, because if you've got someone who's more on the extrovert spectrum, they do what I call thinking draft mode.
Ah.
So when I ask a question, say if it was a really simple question like, where shall we go for lunch?
Mm-hmm.
The extrovert might sit there and say something like, oh, well, we could go for sushi, but actually, no, we had sushi last week, but there's a really cool place that's opened up down the road. Although I did hear that that's a bit expensive and I'm a bit broke at the moment. So you know what? Actually, why don't we just go to the sushi place?
Yes.
And so you kind of get this process as it happens, whereas somebody who is much more on the introvert scale has the same thought process. They're having all of those ideas, but you don't hear anything other than let's go for sushi, because they internalize that thinking. And so particularly for those in the audience who tend to be more extroverts themselves, what we know is that the extrovert will leave a really tiny pause before they jump in and fill the gap, because they go, oh, they haven't responded, so they either didn't understand or they don't care, or, they didn't, I'll either rephrase the question or I'll repeat it or I'll just give them an answer. And so you need to be aware a little bit of where do you fit on that, but also who am I dealing with and where might they fit. And particularly for couples where there's one of them tends to be much more extroverted and one tends to be much more introverted, you really do need to be aware of that when you're having these challenging conversations.
An excellent tip. I love that. I've not heard of draft mode, and yet it is so incredibly accurate. Nicole, let's talk about husbands and wives. We have lots of uncomfortable conversations on a day-to-day, just being in a partnership. And then most of our listeners are working together with their partners. So it really raises the stakes. And so we thought today we would chat through, I guess, perhaps identifying when an uncomfortable conversation might be about to happen and how we can slow down that conversation so that we can navigate our way through it rather than feeling triggered and emotional all the way through, which so many of us do. Can you give us maybe your top tips on how to navigate, first understanding that, okay, this conversation is about to get challenging, or how to set the frame if the conversation needs to be challenging? If we're taking a difficult question perhaps to our partner, how could we set that up then?
Yeah. And look, I think there's two things that make a conversation challenging. One is we're afraid of the response that we're going to get, or we're afraid of the reaction that will come from even putting this question out there. And the second one is that we think the other person is going to get really upset. So it depends once again on who's there asking the question as to which one might be driving the difficulty in the conversation.
Yeah.
So if it's the one where you are worried about the reaction, so if you're someone who doesn't like conflict and you're worried that by starting this conversation, you're going to end up in conflict, there's a couple of things to think about. One is, how do I frame this issue? And so the idea here, say if you've made a decision about, I'm going to come back to this idea of investing something in the business. And if I reach out and if I know from previous conversations, perhaps my partner just doesn't feel like it's the right time to invest or something, and I know that I'm going to get a no or a negative reaction, the way that I want to start that conversation is actually by saying, I want to talk about, and something that's very vague around it, I want to talk about how we're going to grow the business. I might not mention that touchy word of investment.
Yep.
Then I'm going to start with, well, what's all the evidence that I've got to support why I believe investment is right? I want to talk about, here's the numbers that show that this is what's happening. Here's somebody who I've got as a case study where they got a piece of, this particular piece of software or a piece of hardware or something. They've had amazing success. here's, you know, information about what it looks like. So what I'm going to suggest is that we do a bit of further research around it. So what I'm asking them for is something that they can agree to at this stage. I'm not asking the big ticket item at the end. So you want to break down that difficult conversation into things. How can we move it along chunk by chunk by chunk so that I can take them along on this journey without making it too scary for them to say yes to a big thing? Because one of the things that I really want to do when I'm trying to negotiate in difficult circumstances is avoid getting a no.
Yes.
Because once I get a no, I've now created another problem that they don't want to be seen to back down.
Yes.
Because that's a challenge to their ego.
Yeah, totally.
So I never want to ask for something until I think I've got them ready to be able to say yes.
I love the framing of that. And I love the small agreements before we get to the big chunky conversation. And then there are times when we don't have the opportunity to frame it. We've fallen into, let's say we're reviewing the financials for the month and there's been a few decisions that are perhaps reasonably questionable. And so we need to have a really tough conversation about why those decisions were made. They're always going to be triggering for a couple because it's about money and it's very emotive.
Yep.
So you find yourself in this opportunity for conflict. Is there a way to get out of it without conflict?
I think the first thing that I would say is you want to recognize that this is a difficult conversation. So particularly where you are in a couple where you've got, you know, you've got work conversations, you've got personal conversations, and in an ideal world, you don't want those two to mix. You want to be able to have an argument about something at work, but still be able to have a pleasant conversation about planning your next holiday or figuring out who's going to do school pickup tomorrow. So I think the idea there is really to be very clear in the first place when you're having work time and when you're having personal time, and to the extent that it's possible to have very clear boundaries. So the first thing I'd say is we need to have a work conversation about this. Can we go? And in an ideal world, once again, you're going to have a separate space. If you've got a little office area, something that's in the home, that's, you know, mainly used for work, I would try and relocate physically to that space to have this conversation. So it's very clearly delineated. We're now in work mode. And I think, you know, even for some people, I think that's one of the challenges of working from home is for a lot of people, it's now that differentiation has gone. So that's why even for me, most of the time when I'm at work, I will still dress like I'm going into the office because that gives me a sign that I'm in a different mode.
Yes.
So I think with these conversations, if you can put it into a different space so that it's very clear that this is work, it helps to sort of unblend those difficult moments and stop them sort of impacting on the personal side of life as well. So that would be the first thing. And then assuming that you've got that, I think once again, having the information ready to go, having a discussion that says, you know, we've spent too much on this and and we talked about this, and they go, what do you mean it's too much? It's not too much. We've got plenty of money in the bank. And being able to say, no, it felt like it was really low. If you've got exact details, this is how much the bank balance is today. Here it is. And even if you can show them and go, here's a copy of the statement from today, putting things visually. And once again, some people are much more visual than they are than other people are. So if you've got that in front of them, can really make a difference.
I think that's a fantastic tip. We often find there is that it's challenging conversation to have when it comes with money, but we don't necessarily all have the same information or the same data unless it's in there in front of you. So we use a lot of spreadsheets at Tradies in Business. And there are other ways you can do this. It doesn't need to be with a spreadsheet. If you've got the data, it's hard to argue against the data. It takes a lot of the emotion out of the conversation. Same can be said when we're dealing with a challenging client. If we've got data in front of them, so that's why it's so important to have your contracts, for example, nice, tight and clear. We've got good terms and conditions. We can always pull back to that. And there's nearly always a solution in there anyway. It doesn't need to be.
And the interesting thing about that is when you look at conflict, the data is absolutely critical. So I use a tool called the ladder of inference, and a sort of shortened version of that. And what we've got in any conflict is we've got our data. So there's all this information, and I have a certain amount of information, and then I'm at a certain point. So for example, if I've got data, I've got all my timesheets and records of work done on a client's job, and I've got the invoice that was sent, and I've got the information that this invoice is now 60 days overdue, and then I've left them messages and they've promised to pay, but they're not paying. So my conclusion is these guys are going to try and get out of the bill. They are, just being a pain in the backside. They probably think that I can't afford to sue them, and they're just trying their luck.
Yeah.
And I'm probably going to be feeling pretty angry about that. Now, the reality is it's not that information itself that leads us to that conclusion. It's the interpretation that we put on that information. And so when you've got a conflict, what you want to be doing at the beginning is to go, okay, well, once I start this conversation, I need to know, does the other person have all the data that I've got? And is there any data that they've got that I don't already have? Then I need to go, okay, well, regardless of, we now have the same set of data because we've shared our data, but are we interpreting it or making different assumptions about that data? So if the client goes, yeah, I understand you've sent me the invoice, I understand it's 90 days, but I've been told that builders typically expect payment within 90 days, even though it says 60. So I assumed I had another 30 days to pay it. Well, that's a very different scenario to the client going, actually, no, here's some data that I'm going to give you that you didn't have before, which is I've got somebody else to come in and they've identified 74 defects.
Yeah.
And so it's really about going in, you've got to actually figure out, well, can we share our information? What do you know? What do I know? And how are we interpreting it? My interpretation might be if it says 60 days, if it says 14 days, it's 14 days, and you wouldn't expect it to be any longer than that.
No, totally. I couldn't agree more. I'd like to know if there's a way. So let me try and think about this from a tradies perspective, because maybe there's some key takeaways for us to give our partners to empower them as well. So I've found myself on site, one of our team's done the wrong thing. So we see pretty often that tradies aren't comfortable with the confrontation of, addressing staff around something they haven't completed or something they've done wrong, or, they might make that uncomfortable conversation they have to have. Yep. So I've found myself in one of these conversations and it's become elevated in a way that I didn't necessarily intend it to, or I didn't get a reaction like I thought I was. So we've reached a point like a stalemate. It's uncomfortable. Everybody's feeling a bit yucky. Are there some techniques that we can utilize to remove ourselves from that conversation or pause that conversation in a way that leaves everyone feeling heard, validated, and empowered? Or are there times in which that just won't work at all?
Look, I think a lot of it comes down to what the relationship is before you get into there as well. And so I talk about, because effectively what we're talking here is about giving employee feedback.
Yep.
Which is one of the most hated jobs of anybody who has to manage people. And the challenge with that is I talk about when you're giving feedback, there's sort of three types. One is evaluative feedback, which is, when you come to the end of the year and you're doing a performance review to go, are we going to give this person a pay rise, or do they get some sort of bonus, or are they going on to performance management because they're not meeting the standards? The other type is coaching feedback, which is when somebody's done something wrong, you want to give them feedback so that they can improve in the future. And then the other type of feedback is what we call appreciation, which is basically, it's not necessarily about whether they're doing a good job or not. It's about appreciating them as a human. I love that you always come on time. I love it that you bring in, party pies on a Friday, or you're the first one to shout at the bar every time, whatever it is. And so the easiest way to create an environment where you can give the coaching feedback, particularly when you're going to have to give negative feedback, is to create a bank balance from giving appreciation on a regular basis, because it builds that relationship. Yeah. The person then trusts you and they're not as scared when you give them some negative feedback. So that would be the first thing. Now, of course, sometimes you get to the point where you've got to give that negative feedback and you haven't got that base to fall back on. So the thing that I do there is I would start by saying, look, this is what I've seen, and it's hard without having a specific example, but maybe it's like, what happened was you told me that you had finished checking all of the grouting on the tiles and everything had been cleaned. So you told me that yesterday. I've passed that on to the client. The client has come back to me today and said there is grouting left all over one whole wall, and she's furious because she'd organised for photographers to come in.
Mhm.
I want to understand from your perspective what your thoughts are around what's gone on and what's happened. And before I just go in saying this is all the bad stuff and this is why it's wrong and this is what we're going to do, I want to give them that opportunity to talk so that they feel like it's a conversation rather than it's just a bollocking.
Love it. That is an absolutely fantastic tip. And I know lots of tradies that have found themselves in a position where they've forgotten to do the pre-work and they've just gone straight
Yeah.
into the bollocking. And it's turned into, you know what, typically, well, any of us, when we feel attacked, right, we all go on to
Yeah.
the defensive mode. And so we get into this position where perhaps there's a shouting match. How do we get out of that? Like, it's my position as the business owner and the employer to find a way to calm that down and to either find a resolution or to say,
Yeah.
okay, we'll continue this conversation later. What's the
And
easy way to open that back door?
it's perfectly fine to say, you know what, we're now shouting at each other. This is not productive.
Yeah.
So it is a good time for us to just stop shouting at each other. I want you to go away and have a think about it. I'm going to have a think about it, and let's agree a time to come back, postpone the conversation. So when we're in that situation, and particularly if this has been sprung on someone and they weren't expecting it, they are going to be having a moment of stress.
Yep.
You know, there is always a fear of job security when you've stuffed something up.
Mm.
And if you can actually, what happens when we're in stress is our brain actually shuts down. From a neurobiological perspective, we get flooded with adrenaline and cortisol, and it stops the rational thinking part of our brain. So if we can actually just recognize that now is not the time, but don't let them get out of it, because a lot of people go, I can't talk about this now, and they'll walk off.
Yes.
You need to get that agreement to say, okay, we both need to come back. Let's put a time for when we're going to have a chat about this.
Mm.
And then hopefully, particularly if they have stuffed up, hopefully they'll have calmed down a little bit. And you might even want to send them a message or something. Look, I really want to hear your perspective on this, because, as I said, they need to understand that they've got a say, and there might be something we missed.
Yeah.
Maybe the client came in and said, oh, look, we're just photographing it from this angle, so don't worry about that wall. And you said it was done because what the client needed to have done was done.
Mm.
Now, we're never going to hear that if we just rage in and give them a bollocking. So creating that space and making them feel that they're going to be heard is just super critical.
I think every tip or everything that we've spoken about today is actually really good parenting advice as well. I'm sitting here listening to you, Nicole, and thinking about, oh, I could have done that better. Oh, now I understand why that one went the way it did, particularly with teenagers. But even little people, they can be very hard. We can't negotiate with them. I don't even know why we try, and yet we do as parents.
We
So I
do, but you know what? Even teenagers, it's really difficult because the frontal lobe where we do our thinking doesn't actually mature until, well, it's interesting. The science is telling us it's happening later and later, because it's only when we are left to stand on our own 2 feet that the brain actually gets the opportunity to fully develop.
Yeah.
So, you know, where you've got teenagers who are living at home longer and longer, mum and dad are taking care of all this stuff for them, they don't get to make the mistakes that allows their brain to fully mature. So that's a whole different conversation though.
It's another great tip for why you need to approach with caution when you're dealing with your apprentices. I think that
Yeah.
that's a whole nother conversation. I'd actually really love to have that one with you, Nicole. I think that there's some big changes that we're seeing in the apprentices that are coming through, because their lives are very different than ours are as employers or were when we were the employee. Times are very different now than they were 15, 20 years ago. And whilst I'm sure to some extent every generation says that, it's never been as different as it has this time. There's some huge differences that create different behaviours. Again, that's another conversation. Great opportunity for us to have you back to share some more of your wisdom. But I think today we have had some incredible tips. My favourite one of all was draft mode. That's going to be a great concept for me to take into just thinking about who I'm dealing with and how they're dealing with that conversation as we're having that conversation, even with clients. That'll be fascinating. I'd
Excellent.
love for you to share with us, Nicole, where can people find out more, particularly about your negotiation GP service, which I think is just a brilliant opportunity for people to shortcut some of those challenging conversations and a way to find a solution pretty quickly.
Yeah, fantastic. So the GP service you can access through its own website, which is negotiationgp.com. And as I said, I mean, that's really geared up around the fact if you've got a sore throat that hasn't gone away after a week, you're going to go to the GP and get a diagnosis for what to do. And if you've got a negotiation that you've been losing sleep over for a week and you haven't figured out the solution, you can book in. It's a half-hour call and we go through everything to understand things. And in most cases, the half-hour call is enough just to give you the confidence to go, okay, now I've got a strategy, I can go and deal with it. Other information, and I've got a blog and a podcast that you can access through my other website, which is nicoledavidsonnegotiation.com.au.
Fantastic. I've listened to your podcast. I like it as well. There's just so much information for people to tap into if they want to. It's a great opportunity to upskill and start to get better at communicating because it's such an essential thing that we do all day, every day.
Yeah.
Generally, without being mindful, we just kind of roll into a communication opportunity without thinking about how we're doing it. So thank you very much again for your incredible time. I really enjoy our conversations. I learn so much. So I know that our listeners are learning a bunch as well. Listeners, if you are sitting there thinking that this would be really helpful, please reach out to Nicole. All the links will be in the show notes for you. And if you have a topic that you'd like Nicole to speak on, please send it through. If it's not something we chat about here, I'm sure it's something that Nicole either already has some information on or would love to talk about on her own podcast. Thanks, Nicole. Great to see you.
Great to see you again too, Nic.